And thank everyone once again for coming along to this one. I'm particularly looking forward to this one. We're really lucky to have, and I was just speaking to Mugendi beforehand, just how busy Mugendi is. So we're really fortunate to have some time. And I think just before the session, Mugendi was quite literally signing some forms so that he could get some time to do this. So he's quite literally signing bits of his life away in order to be here. So let's give Mugendi M'RITHAA, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name there, Mugendi, my apologies, a great welcome. Mugendi is the Dean and Professor of Industrial Design at Machakos University, and I've just learned today that he's also the Acting Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Administration, I believe, Mugendi. You know that?
Yes, planning and finance as well. Yes.
And finance, of course.
Yes.
How could I have forgotten that other lovely thing that we have in academia, that all the other stuff you've got to do, as well as the interesting stuff. And the interesting stuff from Mugendi is fantastically interesting. If you look at Mugendi's career, I think it would be fair to say, perhaps, Mugendi, that you've crossed a number of disciplinary boundaries. But I think what's particularly interesting is one of the perspectives that you might hopefully bring to the discussion today. So just before I hand over to Mugendi, just a quick reminder that the next features of Design Education discussion, that will be on the 9th of December. So that's in 3 weeks' time, not 4 weeks' time. It'll also be at the slightly later time of 4 o'clock GMT. That's 4 o'clock in the UK. And that's because we're going to be doing quite a sort of a American time zone heavy thing. It's going to be the pluriversal working group from the future singular of Design Education project. So that was the project that Don Norman and others set up. But it's the pluriversal group, that's Leslie Ann, that's going to sort of lead that one on the, hi Leslie Ann, on the 9th of December. That session is really heavily booked up, so please get your sign up in as soon as you possibly can. I'll stick a link into the text in just a second. But never mind that, I'm going to hand over now just to Mugendi, and thank you for your time once again, and over to you.
Thank you, Derek, and great to see everyone. I actually watched some of your other talks on the series, and I saw a number of faces, including Leslie's. So nice to see people again in this context. I want to thank Byron, whom I've known for many years, and with whom we've had many so-called toccacinos where we seek Afri-clarity. So this hopefully will be one of those sessions that I'm able to share with a wider audience. Byron, try not to doze off, since this is a conversation you may have heard many times over. So thank you. So I'll just share my screen for now, and then get through a quick presentation. And then after the presentation, we have a quick discussion. So it's just a couple of slides to put my talk in perspective. I'm hoping everyone can see what I'm projecting.
Perfect, looks great.
Okay, very good. So the broad or umbrella area of interest for me and my friends is socially conscious design. And this is because in Africa, we realized very quickly that any design endeavors would have to somehow impact directly on communities. In a sense, it's a form of, it's a way in which we as creatives or designers vindicate our existence, both existentially and professionally. And beyond that, it's also humanizes us in the context that we operate, particularly within our spheres of influence on the continent. So you'll note that I've spelled Africa with a K. That is a deliberate epistemological tool that we've adopted on the continent. Byron and many others on the continent have been co-creating an emerging narrative of an Africa that hopefully will be more better understood despite the nuances of a continent with so many people and cultures and languages. So very quickly, you may have also heard of Ubuntu. This is a Pan-African philosophy of humanness. And I want to add, it's not communism, but communitarianism. And the distinction there is that it's about doing things together. It does not subsume the individual and relegate them to a lesser value, but rather reminding us of the interconnectedness of people with those that they are in a community or society with. So the more famous saying in Ubuntu is, I am because we are. But for those of us in design, particularly co-design and participatory design, we kind of emphasize the participatory aspect of Ubuntu, and therefore I would rather present to you, I participate, and therefore I am. So Africa is big. Many of you are aware of that happily, as a major geographic regions, but also strangely, our geography has also somehow, in a sense, reflects our geopolitics. So if you look at the Africa in the Sahara region, which is essentially the Northern Africa, all the way from Morocco on the west to Egypt on the east, and Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia and other countries in between, it's got a unique culture, which is predominantly Islamic and Arabic in orientation. And then once you get to this very green tropical zone between the equator and the two tropical lines, you find that it's got a very rich and what I would almost call an Africa dense kind of culture. And then you get to Southern Africa, where there's the Kalahari Desert and the Namib Desert. And again, you have a different kind of culture with the Khoisan and other communities that live there. So this is the reality we live with. So even when we speak about Africa with a K, as this emerging narrative of Africans co-creating their own story, we're also cognizant of the fact that ours is an incredibly rich and diverse continent, 2,500 languages plus, and myriad cultures. So I'm going to reference one proverb from the famous Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. Many of you who've been students of literature may have read some of his work, like Things Fall Apart and No Longer at Ease. And one of the proverbs he references from his Nigerian society is this one, which really talks to the core of the post-colonial discourse. So it basically says that until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Now, as we co-create this narrative that I've just referenced, this is part of the fact that the hunter's story has been spoken of and glorified way beyond, it's gotten more airtime than most likely it deserves, yet he's not the only actor in this arena. So there's an attempt by many of us, therefore, to stand up and be counted as the Lions historians, if you may. And myself and Byron are such individuals and such designers. So, but then we constantly want to remind ourselves that as much as Africa has its unique geopolitical and cultural context, there's a lot of issues that connect us to the rest of humanity. And so this infographic here usually reminds us of that fact, that if we look at the world as 100 people, suddenly we start to realize that there's a lot more that we have in common as a human family. So for example, I'll just jump to something like literacy, that we have about 83% of humanity that is literate. You get to places like Kerala in South India, it's actually 100%. And then you'll find also in terms of housing, there are many challenges, and Africa is no exception. And in terms of people who have computers, about 22% do have computers, and so on. Yet, if you look at the speed with which mobile telephony has changed the demographics in terms of access to information, you'll find that almost 83% of humanity has access or has a mobile phone. So this means we can leapfrog into solutions and ideas and concepts that previously would have taken a much longer time if we followed a traditional route, and we can adopt those tools to advance our agenda. So here I'd like to basically just speak about the megatrends that we witness in our society. I know all of you here are informed by them because they impact everyone around the world. For example, the shifting economic power. And this is interesting because here we reference China, but as you watch what's going on between the Ukraine-Russia debacle, you'll notice that there's an acceleration of this shift There's countries that now are moving towards de-dollarization, and other conversations about the role of OPEC in shifting the global economic power and so on. So there's BRICS, which South Africa is a member of, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And recently there's another bloc known as MINT, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And there's interesting dynamics around those economic shifts. Then the second of those megatrends is around climate change. As we speak, COP27 is happening in Egypt, which is right at the northeast of Africa. And I think it's fitting that Africa should be hosting this very important conversation around climate change. And what is interesting is the way in which climate change impacts on so many other societal concerns. So for example, the immigration that you see, if I can call it that, though it's illegal, of people migrating mainly from West and North Africa into Southern Europe is driven by climate change because most of those are essentially young people are no longer able to till the land on which they derive their sustenance. And so they're forced to look for other alternatives because of unpredictable weather patterns. And unfortunately, this has led to other geopolitical tensions, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. The third and possibly the most exciting of the megatrends for the designerly community is the technological breakthroughs that we're witnessing as the blurring of the human and the machine become very, very interesting. Personally, I get very excited, but one has to enter into this space in a kind of a cautious manner because I believe the conundrums, the ethical conundrums that are constantly emerging mean that we have to think far more than we act. We have just about any possible technologies today, and we can do things which previous generations could only dream of. But then the consequences of our decisions may have much further reaching consequences than those other generations that came before us. And as we enter in Africa, we are starting to enter into the fourth industrial revolution, where we have been a little bit suspicious of robotics and artificial intelligence. Well, some parts of the world are entering the fifth industrial revolution, where robots have become what are now called cobots, which are essentially collaborative robots. So maybe we will be able to move to see, as telling Derek, some of the scary things we do. If you put a smiley face, it seems to change things. And I've seen that with robotics. And then, of course, demographic and social change is the other one. And I mentioned migration. The other is population aging, which is impacting everyone. More dramatically in places like France and maybe Japan and China, but I can assure you even in Africa, people are living longer. And so the pressure on social security and all the amenities that an aging population requires is critical. In Europe, I believe this has led to the raising of the retirement age a couple of times, particularly in places like the UK and France. While in Africa, we have a relatively young population. I think we have the youngest population in the world. And recently we hit the 8 billion population mark. So that's interesting. But we're also aware that that youth kind of bonus we have could bring either dividends or be a ticking time bomb, socially speaking, if we don't take care of our youth. So there's a challenge there. And then rapid urbanization, this is a true challenge across the world, but Africa has most slums. And if you add Asia, I think about 90% of all the slums are in South America, Africa, and Southern or Southeast Asia. Again, many of you are aware of the Future of Jobs report, and this links to our role as educators. And the World Economic Forum has been looking at the top 10 skills that one needed in, say, 2015 and one needs now. And what's interesting is the #1 skill still remains complex problem solving, which is what we designers actually believe we do. But what has happened is that whereas critical thinking was 4th in 2015, now it's #2. And where creativity was 10th and last on that list in 2015, now it's #3. So these first 3 skills, if you may, are what as designers we try to inculcate in our students and hopefully practice as individuals. Again, we talk about lifelong learning because now we've realized, in fact, in the developed world, we know that people can change careers up to 4 times. And so these pivots are becoming more regular. So we are preparing people to change professions in an unprecedented manner. Previously, you'd retire as a teacher or as a doctor or as a lawyer. And now many times you find someone who's started off as a lawyer, then did an MBA, and then moves into IT, and eventually moves into, socially conscious agendas, so this is not uncommon. And so we need to start looking at the competencies that we are bringing out in our learners to see that they actually inculcate lifelong learning as an attribute and as a practice. So again, and this we speak as in the context of the futures of design education, I think Ignacio Estrada says it very nicely. If we don't have an empathic or student-centered pedagogical approach, I think we'll alienate a lot of potential learners. And I like what he says here, that if a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. And I think for me, as an educator or educationist, this is something I actually subscribe to. I believe in student-centered pedagogy, because I think that's the only way we can really justify ourselves as educators, but also because the educational space now has so many other options that didn't exist when some of us were students. Students are even having student-driven learning, where they use all kinds of tools, including YouTube and other online resources, hybrid and blended learning, e-learning, and so on. Whereas we just knew chalk and talk. And that is exciting in many instances, but also a challenge for us in the educational space. But then, of course, we need to realize that there's types of learning that go beyond the visual and auditory, and we need to embrace the full gamut of the way in which our learners would learn and play to their strengths and not leave anyone out. So also design thinking, and I'm going to speak a little bit about design thinking because this is something we've been using more recently, which is an aspect of human-centered design. And essentially just using it to help us understand and grow, deepen empathy for our learners and other stakeholders, and then using that to get into ideation and prototyping of ideas without getting too precious about the things we evolve, because they can change. In fact, we should encourage them to change if we indeed are listening to other people's voices. So I think you're all familiar with this design thinking process. This particular one is a 6-step one. Many of the ones that are usually seen are 5-step, but that's fine. The ones from IDEO and others. Then some design principles which we employ. And I'm speaking as one who's also involved with the D School down in Cape Town, one of which is one conversation at a time, encouraging wild ideas. Incidentally, one conversation at a time is a very African practice. You've often heard of talking sticks, or and the yes and approach, where you do not negate the previous speaker's point of view, but you actually build upon it. And then encouraging wild ideas, deferring judgment is linked to the one conversation at a time. Being visual, which subscribes to design as an approach. Going for quantity and building on the ideas of others, I've referenced that. And the last one I think is very important for us in academic space, because we often punished failure, but now we need to encourage it because it's a form of learning, and to ask people to not only fail early and often, but also to fail forward as a concept so that you learn from your failures. So I'm going to give you just a very quick rundown of a case study where we use design in Cape Town to look at a social challenge using the UN SDGs. As you're aware, these are 17 of them, the goals, with 169 targets. So I'll skip that bit. But the ones that we dealt with are these 8 that I've put up here. The one on good health and well-being. And now we've realized post-COVID that mental health has become a really big challenge. Clean water and sanitation, number 6, affordable energy, industry and infrastructure, number 9, 11 is sustainable cities and communities, 12, responsible consumption and production, climate action number 13, and of course, number 17, which is encouraging international partnerships for the realization of these goals. So the place we went to is an informal settlement outside of a place in Cape Town known as Danune. The actual site is Doornbach, which is in Danune. We looked at the different ways in which we could incorporate UNSDG number 3, number 6, and number 11 as the primary SDGs that we focused on. This gives you a bit of a context of the solid waste challenge we looked at. This is a setting of the informal settlement. This was a situation where solid waste was basically not managed at all, leading to disease and also just general pollution, environmental pollution. This is what system existed with a lot of challenges and the place that we did this. So by engaging the community members in traditional design thinking exercises, we eventually came up with a system, and I'm only showing you the part that the humans really interact with, which is this redesigned bin. It had a containerized solution. It had a service design module in terms of how this process could be monetized by community members so that they owned the process and also gained some sustainable livelihood out of it. And I'll just skip that bit just for now. So essentially, we built these prototypes, which are bins we developed with the community members, hoisted on poles, because they identified the challenges as small children and pets getting into the bin and contaminating themselves and messing up the place. Also, they had to be elevated from the ground to stop them from being knocked over. And then they have holes at the bottom to stop them from being vandalized by people trying to use them as water containers and so on. And the solution as we speak has some 60,000 such bins are now being rolled out in other settlements in Cape Town. And most recently, we were informed that other municipal authorities in the country are interested in rolling out the same solution in other informal settlements. So this is just to give us a bit of a context as we start to have the conversation. And as I conclude, I just wanted to maybe suggest a couple of things. I'm looking at UN SDGs in the short term, but this conversation actually would be relevant to many other aspects of what we do, whether it's Africa Union's Agenda 2063 or others. The first one is we need to realize that multipolarity is the way to go. I think the current geopolitical discourse has shown us the danger of the single story. We need to know that we should adopt a much more nuanced approach to whether there be geopolitical challenges or matters of diplomacy. And we need our students and learners to accept this as becoming the critical way of engagement. Beware of the single story. And then we also need to look at post-coloniality, because what happened, unfortunately, is a lot of our books and our pedagogic discourse has referenced, say, for example, what happened in the Bauhaus and the Ulm School of Design, and often neglects the rich indigenous knowledge systems that exist on the continent and have actually stood the test of time. So change is inevitable and it's imperative, but we need to also embrace it in a way that adds to the growing repertoire of knowledge and not suppress one form for the sake of another. We can coexist in a much richer yes and ethos. Then the new normal, as we've seen since COVID hit us, is that massive disruptions are now to be expected. I think expecting the world to go back to a pre-COVID innocence and naivety may not be feasible. We need to realize that these things can and may happen, especially now that we've hit the 8 billion population mark, and that they are surmountable. See them as unique opportunities for creative, proactive, and transformative thinking. And I'm referencing some proverbs. If you notice, for the first one I spoke about, when the drum beats change, the dancers must adapt their steps. And this second one is tomorrow belongs to those who prepare today. So we need to anticipate the future. This series of talks is about the futures of design. And I love the fact that it's not future, but futures of design. So that plurality needs to be captured and celebrated. Diversity is something we need to embrace, even in the pedagogic discourse that we advance. And then finally, the 21st century, and I add their life skills, because it shouldn't just be about student attributes or learner attributes. It should be about life, because the world we live in is in a constant state of flux, and also massive disruptions are becoming the new normal. So the future is here and it's digital. So even some of us who are what you might call glorified Luddites had to embrace the technologies that now exist. We had to get online in blended and hybrid programming. Design has been a challenge because it's almost, we've pursued a kind of an apprenticeship model. So we needed to engage with students, but we've realized many of our subjects could actually be taken online and still not lose efficacy in transmission. So I think we need to embrace that because it's the truth. And I've listed a number of things there, but the one I want to emphasize, and you'll see that the word stream, the R and the A, because everyone I meet often speaks about STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I think STEAM is more mainstream when we add art and humanities or design. But now recently someone actually said stream, and I just put it there in italics because I wasn't sure if it was a fad or it's something that has become mainstream. And that has to do with robotics. Robotics, as we know, seeks to bring both sides of the human hemispheres of thinking together, the rational and the emotional together. So with that said, I'd like to conclude my formal presentation and enter into a kind of a dialogue with you, and just end with the understanding that empathy and solidarity will help us through this uncertainty that we have to navigate going forward. Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, put it so beautifully that I just felt I wouldn't want to even attempt a paraphrase. He says that I feel the other, I dance the other, therefore I am. It might also be a bit cliche because Africans are known for their dance and music, but I'm hoping you can see the deeper philosophical meaning imbued in that. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you and open this up for a discussion. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Mugendi. That was really, really, really interesting. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of synergies with, as you say, some of the things, definitely some of the themes that have emerged over the last two and a half years from the futures of design education. So it's really, really good to hear those repeated and amplified, and also emerging independently and with their own contextualizations and character as well. It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for that. Really interesting. I told you it's going to be an interesting one, didn't I? So I'm just going to open it right out to anybody who wanted to jump in and ask any questions, make any observations as well. And I'm desperately trying, I'm going to not try to talk as much this time. So I'm just going to go from the top left to right. So Byron, have you pre-arranged this, by the way?
Mugendi, I wonder if you could maybe just talk a bit about how it's been forced negotiate sustainability, either due to resource issues or lack of access to resources. Maybe if you could talk just a bit about the project you worked, example of hybridized cars, and just the comment you made, which I really like, where you talk about Africa has always been sustainable. It needs design to keep it that way. Maybe also bringing some of the examples of Kenya and how there is almost an industrial craft happening, which is hybridizing different economies.
Yeah, thanks, Byron. This is indeed a very important point. I think I've often emphasized it, and thank you for reminding me of that. that we often argue that Africa is sustainable by default. And the challenge for us in the designerly community is to keep it that way by design. So the idea of circular economy, the whole idea of recycling and reuse, where we have second life, whether it's driven by harsh economic circumstances or something that is a lot nobler, like wanting to keep the environment clean, has been something that has been recognized. And I think what's happening at present, like there's a project we did more recently here in Machakos, which is where I'm based now, which is about 65 kilometers southeast of Nairobi. And we're looking at hair extensions that ladies usually use for the makeshift salons. And we unfortunately saw that there was a lot of damage to the environment because of the way it was disposed of upon, when they removed the ones they had already, when they were done with. And so the project essentially engaged these local crafts communities and others, and a group of persons with disabilities. And what amazed us was they immediately drove us towards a certain direction and said, actually, we'd like to do some prototyping and see if we can weave some of these hair into baskets. And then the men, after observing the women, saw that there were short offcuts that could not be used for weaving the baskets. And they said, we make clay bricks, and we'd like to try to embed those clay bricks when they're still wet with the offcuts of the hair, the synthetic hair, and see what happens. And wonder of wonders, when they did mix this hair with the bricks, they became stronger and even survived the fires in the kilns. And so now small micro businesses have emerged out of that. And the women are very happy. They've organized collection systems using the product service system kind of model, where the people who collect the hair from the salons get some money, and the women who weave the baskets are also getting their money. And finally, this gets sold off as useful utilitarian baskets, yet and solving a problem all at once. We wish we could have avoided this, but the sad bit is it's sustainable because there's so much waste. And hopefully this is going to continue providing livelihoods. So I think to Byron's point, the reality is that resource scarcity is found across the continent. And we found that when we approach, and now fortunately I'm in this seat as the acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for planning, administration, planning and finance, and now I can understand why they ask those questions. If you cannot justify the financials of a given project, and it's only social impact that you're focusing on, you will get partial buy-in. But if you can provide a business model that shows that you can actually gain, or the institution can gain, or a client can gain, or corporate can gain by doing this, we succeed. I don't know how many of you may have noticed, but there was something interesting that has just been developed or endorsed during the COP27. And this has to do with carbon credits and carbon taxes. And Africa has emerged as one of those regions that actually is very happy to trade carbon credits with carbon taxes. And there's estimates that suggest by 2030, Africa would be able to generate about $30 billion a year on trading in carbon credits for those nations that need to. Secondly, by 2050, they expect that amount to go up to 120 billion per year. So what countries like Kenya are doing is we are already way beyond our target in tree planting for sequestering carbon dioxide, and other countries like now Rwanda, Uganda, Congo are starting to join in. And what it means essentially is we don't need to decimate our forests or even the land we've given, set aside for wildlife, because we can make money by keeping, nature pristine, and even greening the world for others who are messing it up. They can pay the tax, and that can become a sustainable income for these African countries. So the minute you have a financial model, I think things become easier to justify. And this has been the challenge we've been having of justifying how by engaging with indigenous knowledge systems, or even the issue of sustainability, we can actually make it profitable and not only good for the environment, but also socially and financially sustainable. Thank you.
Yeah, it strikes me that that's the interconnectedness thing. I think that I certainly really appreciated from just looking at the history of your work as well, Mugendi. You can really hear that coming through, that connectedness, if you like, of the systems. Michael, did you want to jump in? Off you go. Oh, did Michael?
Yeah. While we wait for Michael, I want to give a shout out to Ralitza Debra in Ghana.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, here I am. I was speaking already. Your picture switched and then I got confused. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your lovely talk. I think I have a small question, at least I hope so. So it's about your example of the community in Cape Town and the bins in connection with design thinking. Has the community really taken ownership of this idea, or is it something that fell from the sky, top down, developed by some people? Because I think the buy-in of the community, that they see the use of it and the benefit, is really crucial. And I'm not sure design thinking is enough. Does it work?
Thank you, Michael. And I appreciate that critical optimism, because this is exactly what we need as designers. Let me give you an example of how the buy-in actually happened. The mayor of the city of Cape Town approached us at the university and said, we hear Cape Town is the world design capital. What does that mean and how can that benefit informal settlements, not just the corporates and the city fathers and mothers? And so the city identified this community, this informal settlement. And I think it was almost a challenge to us to prove that we can walk the talk. So as soon as we put together a team of professors and students, mainly postgraduate students, we approached the gatekeepers. There was the ward councillor and other members there. And the ward councillor introduced us to community leaders. So as soon as we landed, we realized that we had to, first of all, take what some call the ABCD model. In academics, we call it appreciative inquiry, but in the NGO world, ABCD is asset-based community development. And we adopted that because we needed to manage expectations so that they realize the solutions would only emerge from within. We identified some local champions, some of the owners of those shacks in that informal settlement actually had beautiful little gardens in front of their shack, surrounded and demarcated with empty beer bottles, very beautifully done. And so we identified them as our, internal champions. So when we had our first meeting, some of them came and shared how they're able to manage their own environment in terms of managing the waste. And the community members responded very favorably to that, actually, and we decided that's the route we'd take. Then the second thing they told us is they needed birth certificates for their children. Now, I can assure you this set us back because that was not part of our terms of reference. And we had nothing to do with birth certificates. And some of us almost took off, but we said, look, if we're to build trust with this community, we need to at least have authentic listening. We need to, speak to their listening as well. So we managed and told them we cannot promise solution, but we'll escalate the matter to the city authorities because it's a matter of concern. Fortunately, in their motivation, we asked them, why are you talking about birth certificates when we are here to talk about solid waste? And they say, because our children are our future. Without birth certificates, they're not able to get into school. They don't even get medication. Basically, our future is without hope. And they also told us that Dunbach was the name of the dairy farm that they invaded in 1994, but they had a different name for their community in isiXhosa, which is the local language. And it's Sibabalwe. And Sibabalwe basically means we are blessed. And we found that very interesting. And we decided to adopt that name as the name of the place because that's what that spoke to their aspirations. And eventually the city also, took it up, but that was something that we let the community lead and the process was owned. So even the bins we had come up with were like the bins you saw, the gray ones, which didn't work. And the community, some members had actually experimented with something similar to what we eventually did. They would tie with a wire a broken bucket on top of a pole or on the fence, and then they would make holes with hot iron so that any drainage seep through, so pests like mosquitoes or other bugs wouldn't find that to be hospitable. And that was the beginning of the conversation. So immediately they saw we are talking about things they've already done and they can relate to that. So by the time we came up with an industrial design solution, we had been embraced by the community. And even as we speak, that community has continued using design thinking or something similar to resolve other issues, even social issues, like sitting down and prototyping different ways of engagement. And that is way beyond us. So what I'd like to suggest is maybe for us as designers, we need, even though we come up with an empowerment agenda, we need to be open to an emancipatory outcome. And emancipation in this sense means they don't even need us anymore and they're happy, and that's good. And not to make them dependent on us, because what we did was give them a hand up, not a hand out. And I think as a philosophy that has really helped us go even in other communities and other settings to make sure that we are not paratrooping or parachuting into the community with our own resources and ideas and extracting everything on the way out.
Thank you. Yes, it's the God is in the detail, implementation.
Yeah, definitely. Indeed. Yeah, to me, that also aligns with you're quite explicit in your use of the word community and communities as well, Mugendi, like not a socio-political construct, not a theoretical construct, but a tangible construct, a real community. That seems to be quite an important catalyst as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to move on to Juan.
I just wanted to highlight, Ralitza has just posted the project of the,
lovely.
So you can check it out.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ralitza. Thank you very much. Brilliant. I'll make sure there's a link of that under the, sorry. Yep, go ahead, Ralitza. Did you want to say something there?
No, I was saying my pleasure. And I also had a privilege to be part of the project. So it was exciting to hear it's been shared as well. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Cool.
Thanks, Raleigh. Remember, Raleigh was completing her PhD and she joined us and brought a very powerful communication angle to the project, using traditional African symbols from the Ghanaian Adinkra symbols and also the Bantu symbols. She even worked with healthcare workers to bring that kind of series of graphic design communication tools to informal settlements, even in Grabo in Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you.
Cool. That sounds like maybe a potential futures conversation, maybe. Raleigh, I'll maybe give
yes, and Byron needs to tell you about community-based tourism, which we did with himself and one other friend, Lyle Sprong, out in Genadendal. Byron, I've set you up. Revenge is sweet. Yes.
Awesome, brilliant. Okay, Juan, I'm going to come to you because before we start assigning each other tasks to do. This could get dangerously out of control.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much, Mugendi, for your presentation. I am a design researcher from Peru, and I was quite interested in this new ontological approach to Africa. And you mentioned now it's Africa with a K. I'm just really curious about that because I feel that there's a similar process going on in Latin America in redefining who we are. And I just wonder if you can extend that explanation of what could be some particular interesting elements about this resignification, maybe some authors to read, people to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And in fact, I believe this next part is totally relevant to parts of the world that had disruptions. We might be experiencing disruption in COVID-19, but the colonial project had similar disruptive, results in many of our developing parts of the world. Now, Africa with the K, let me start with Africa with the C. So Africa with a C is how we construct this idea of Africa as viewed from the outside looking in. So we're using this as a kind of a heuristic, if you may, of how Africa is seen by those that are not in Africa or are not friendly towards the African project or may not be aware of what is truly African. So for example, this is what would happen if you met someone in some part of the world and they said, oh, you're from Cape Town. I have a friend in Lagos in Nigeria. Maybe you know him. So it's trying to say that Africa is a much richer place. And so Africa with the C is Africa as viewed from the outside looking in. Now, this is contrasted with Africa with the K, which is not just the changing of one letter in that spelling, but also because of the 2,500 languages plus on the continent, all without exception spell Africa with a K. Whether it's in Swahili or any of those other languages, Shona or Zulu, they all spell, even Afrikaans, they spell Africa with a K. So we've taken this to mean that this is Africa as viewed from the inside looking out. So this is the new emerging co-created narrative created by Africans and friends of Africa so that the world may see who we are. It's also inspired by that proverb I shared of Chinua Achebe, that until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. But it's also a very generous approach, because the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, said it beautifully. He said, I'm not an African because Africa was born. I'm not an African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. So we have friends in the diaspora who may not be on the continent, but then they also love and cherish this idea of an emerging, resplendent, positive and vibrant Africa. And so they too are welcome to this idea of Africa with a K. I'm not an African because I was born in Africa. And in my case, I say I'm not an African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was reborn in me. So it's a series of rebirths. Like at one time it was just purely geographic or pedagogical. Now it's deeply philosophical and spiritual. So it's a constant evolution, if you may, of what it means to be African, or what Africa means to me and to those that I engage with. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Just quickly, Juan, I mean, did you want to reflect on, like from your own position? I mean, does that seem to strike a chord or ring a bell with what you referred to in your question?
Yeah, definitely. I feel that I think it's not just that, but in general, I get this feeling. I hope I'm not totally wrong or half wrong. Mm-hmm. That in general, in different parts of the world, not just the South, but also in the North, there is this intention to resignify different ontological meanings, not just in places in the South, but also in the North, how to think again about who we are. And I think that's really healthy for that community, the global community in general. So it's really nice to get to know more people in that beyond.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. And it's great because one of the former presidents of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, led the Africa Renaissance project. And it was essentially about the rebirth or the rediscovery of Africa and rejuvenating that narrative, because Africa was coming of age. And I think it's very powerful. I've seen similar, transitions within Latin America, and it's driven by the same desire to reclaim one's identity and not, allow that narrative to be, shaped by others. So if it's shaped, it needs to be done in a participatory manner so that every voice is heard and every voice is accommodated. Thank you.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for those reflections as well, Juan. It was very nicely put, actually, and I think, yeah, you're definitely onto something. I'll put you on the list for future conversations as well, by the way. Emma, did you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much, Mugendi. It was so interesting to hear what you had to say, and I think also the way you've linked these meta-global trends, particularly to the African context, which was really interesting. And I suppose underneath all of that, or things that were coming to my mind, was this notion of, you know, consequences of design thinking and action, and short-termism that has got us into these series of crises. And I was listening to a Guardian podcast yesterday from COP, reflecting on, you know, the tough conversations that need to happen at political levels around growth and development, and how it's the ethical responsibility for the global north to change our development models particularly. And underpinning a lot of this was, you know, how do you begin to have those difficult conversations at political levels to get to different perspectives of growth, post-growth. And I think for educationalists, it's how do we have those conversations at educational levels. One of the things we're struggling with at the OU is a sense of longness, if you like, within an educational plan, within an educational journey. At the OU, we have a banner of lifelong learning, but in effect, it's still a 3-year degree. And, you know, the business of education is to deliver it in that timeline. And I suppose what I was wondering was, within the African context, is there a way of looking at time that we could learn from, that perhaps links people's sensibility of time and their educational journey in different ways, both from a sort of, I don't know, design methods point of view, or from an institutional view in education about how time is represented? Because I think it's a really important thing, this notion of our forward-facing consequences. And as educationalists, you want to try and reflect that in the way and how you teach. But the infrastructures and structures in which we teach are often limiting us. And I just wondered if there's things we can take forward that perhaps help us deal with time and a sense of forecast in different ways.
Indeed, Emma, I couldn't agree more, because I think Susan Sontag put it so beautifully when she said that superficiality is the curse of our age. And I think it's something we must constantly fight against. We need to deepen understanding, deepen discourse, so that it's not at the superficial or at the perfunctory level. We need to genuinely and authentically listen to others, so that we might find different solutions. Ivan Illich, one of the commentators around the 70s, wrote this beautiful book, 2 of them actually. One was Deschooling Society, in which he challenges the educational project as having been hijacked by industry. And the second one was Tools for Conviviality, in which he says we need to have limits to the industrial project, because we are so-called development is taking people out of the equation in this expansionist economic model. So I'm also very suspicious of politicians who keep talking about growth without looking at the other aspects like equilibrium and how we can attain that. But you've raised a very interesting point, and this makes me think of the concept of African time. And those of us on the continent constantly debate this, because there's certain places where African time means 2 hours late, other places it means 15 minutes late. For Byron and Ralitza and myself, we've attempted desperately to keep a universal understanding of time. Sometimes we win, but most times we do win, and occasionally we do lose out, depending on who we are interacting with. And it takes us back to the Greek concepts of time, chronos, for chronological time, and then kairos, which is a word for event time. Now, African time is actually kairos. It's event time, which is why, if like now, just before I started this meeting, Derek witnessed me haggling with one of my colleagues because I needed to get into this meeting. And Kairos was about to usurp Chronos, but I desperately clawed on to Chronos and managed to hang in there. And thankfully I'm here, but I can tell you, as soon as I'm done, Kairos is going to drag me kicking and screaming into the next activity. So the whole idea of the importance of the event, which is why people don't understand sometimes, that if I am walking to a meeting and I meet someone who is in need, that person's need supersedes the need to meet at a specific time. This is event time. And it is not to suggest that I don't respect those that I'm going to meet with, but this event right now is very important and only I can deal with it. So sorry guys, I'll be running late, but I need to deal with this event that has arisen. And then in terms of the educational project, I agree. I think we need new models of education. I think the strict 3-year or even formal education, from what I know, we have formal, informal, and non-formal ways of learning. And I don't think we've embraced the non-formal and informal enough. We need to bring back elements of apprenticeship. We need to, actually give the power back to the student, to the learner, so that they take the lead and we become facilitators supporting the learning exercise and project. I think we've allowed economic and political agendas to take over the academic project, where we are told we have so many, throughputs. We are given specific throughput rates. If you go below a certain rate, you get into trouble and have to explain yourself. We keep talking about inclusive education, yet we are not accommodating the diversity of learners, even in terms of how they learn. So I agree, and maybe it's going to take a bold step of design activism to actually come up with a very different approach to education, one that is more inclusive, more empathic. We need to maybe adopt a couple of new virtues. One is empathy, another is authenticity, another is obviously humility, and also inclusiveness. And I think the educational project could have a lot more of that, and it would definitely help us as educators feel like we are part of the solution, and the learner would benefit by knowing that they get their money's worth in terms of what they're investing in education. Education, particularly higher education, is a runaway cost right now, whether it's in Kenya or in the US. I was looking at the statistics. The average graduate leaves with about 100 to 150,000 US dollars debt with a degree. In Kenya, the story is not so bad, but you end up, there's a word we've even coined called tarmacking, which is hitting the tarmac, looking for a job. And the average time it takes a graduate today to get a job is 5 years. And that is sad, because you have this young, bright person with an upper second class or first class degree, but no one seems to want to invest in it. And the poor kid gets disillusioned. 5 years later, they're not even sure if they want to get into that profession. So this is a real pressing challenge we need to address if we are to remain relevant, particularly in the post-COVID dispensation.
Cool. Thank you for that, Emma. That was a really interesting question. I think there's definitely a future discussion on that one at some point, because I think it's one of the bigger, if you like, it's not just a colonial legacy, it's an international or a global legacy, if you like. One of the big structures is in education, and it is still absolutely hegemonic. It's really a whole bunch of thinking and paradigms. And I know a lot of us have been talking about where should be the futures of design education, where should education takes place. And I think we could maybe do with actually maybe setting up a few discussions and debates that really actually properly poke at that question, because it doesn't feel that it's necessarily the right place to do it from within a particular view of the academy, for all the reasons that you've just so succinctly outlined, and many others have for lots of different reasons as well. So yeah, wow, I told you it was going to be an interesting one, everyone. I told you it was going to be.
I totally agree, Derek. You need to open this up for a dedicated talk, because the first industrial revolution happened many centuries, okay, maybe 3 or 4 centuries ago, and the educational project was linked to servicing that particular industrial revolution.
Yep.
Now we're heading into the 5th industrial revolution, but still using first industrial revolution pedagogic tools. So something needs to happen. And if we're to synchronize with the world of work, where people are allowed to work from home and still be very productive, bring their pets or their kids to work and still, okay, I'm not suggesting that might be chaotic, but I think something somewhere was lost in translation, and we need to really, reflect on this. And I agree, it should be a dedicated conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And even in that, even the industrial paradigm, that itself borrowed so heavily from, well, primarily a social and a political paradigm, of control of who are the people who will get to do this, which again goes back to other structures. So yeah, it's structure upon structure. That definitely, I think that'd be a nice one to do in the future. Yep, and we can maybe set it up a bit more formally. Right. Well, okay. I'm conscious of the time, and I think I'll maybe just end the session at that. And right, Mugendi, thank you so much for that. That was very enlightening. It covered so many topics and areas, but there was still a coherence to it that was very nice from that perspective that you presented to us. So thank you so much for that, Mugendi. Greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. And I've seen beautiful comments on the chat, and thank you for the interactive session. Good to meet all of you, and looking forward. Now I'll definitely want to join in on one of the future ones.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. And I'll say I'll make the recording available as soon as I possibly can.
Okay.
As I say, the next one is going to be in 3 weeks' time. And it might be relevant to where we're kind of going with some of this today already. It will be the Pluriversal Working Group from the project that Don Norman set up to look at future of design education. And, there is a bit of a lineage and a link to some of the more dominant forms, if you like, of education and that particular project. Fortunately, it has had a pluriversal group influencing it. And I believe that some people's minds have been changed as a result of that. But it'll be interesting to hear what the group think. That's in 3 weeks' time, though. That's on the 9th of December. The link is in the chat there. So for now, though, I'd just like to once again thank you very much, Mugendi, and everyone who contributed and all the thoughts and comments and questions as well. And I hope to see you in a few weeks' time. So thank you all very much. Okay, thank you.